They never archived what happened that night. On paper, it was a distinguished guest lecture at one of the most prestigious universities in America. A calm exchange of ideas between a celebrated civil rights leader and the finest academic minds of the era. But what unfolded inside that vaulted lecture hall was something the administration would later refer to only as an unfortunate disruption. The invitation had come directly from the rector's office, a gesture of intellectual openness, a sign that the university was willing to engage diverse perspectives. The hall was filled beyond capacity, students lining the walls, faculty seated in the front rows like a tribunal. Polished shoes, folded arms, restrained expressions. When Martin Luther King Jr. stepped to the podium, the applause was polite, controlled. Some professors clapped with fingertips only. Others didn't move at all. From the third row, Professor Harold Whitmore of the philosophy department watched without expression. Whitmore was a legend in academic circles. Published widely, cited reverently, feared quietly. He believed in reason above sentiment, structure above emotion, hierarchy above chaos. He had not supported the invitation. King began calmly. He spoke not with fire, but with measured clarity, about moral responsibility in democratic societies, about the philosophical foundations of justice, about the danger of intellect detached from conscience. He quoted Augustine, Aquinas, and the American founders in one breath, weaving theology and political theory without raising his voice. The students leaned forward. The faculty did not. Then it happened. King had just said, "A society that educates the mind but neglects the moral soul risks producing intelligent oppressors," when a chair scraped loudly across the wooden floor. Professor Whitmore stood. "This," he said sharply, not waiting for recognition, "is precisely the problem." The hall froze. King stepped slightly back from the microphone, giving him space. Whitmore adjusted his glasses, his tone clinical but loud enough to dominate the room. "What we are hearing," he continued, "is not rigorous philosophy. It is emotional rhetoric dressed in borrowed intellectual clothing." A few restrained chuckles echoed from the faculty rows. King did not interrupt. Whitmore took a step forward into the aisle. "You reduce complex socio-political systems to moral fairy tales. Civilization is not governed by sermons. It is governed by structures, by power, by history. You offer slogans where we require analysis." Now the students were no longer relaxed. Some shifted uncomfortably. Others watched with fascination. King returned to the microphone. "Professor," he said gently, "I welcome analysis." Whitmore's expression hardened. "Then let us analyze," he replied. "You speak of justice as though it floats above human conflict. But justice, Dr. King, is negotiated by those capable of maintaining order, not by those appealing to sentiment." The implication was subtle, but not invisible. King's voice remained steady. "Are you suggesting," he asked quietly, "that moral argument has no place in shaping order?" Whitmore smiled thinly. "I am suggesting that history remembers strength, not idealism." The air in the room shifted. King folded his hands on the podium. "And yet," he replied, "history also remembers those who mistook dominance for wisdom." A murmur spread through the back rows. Whitmore's jaw tightened. "You are a skilled speaker," he said, "but eloquence is not evidence. Your movement thrives on emotional mobilization. Universities exist to protect society from that very impulse." There it was, not shouted, not crude, but unmistakable. The rector rose slightly in his seat, uncertain whether to intervene. This was no longer a lecture. It was something else. King looked out across the hall, not at Whitmore, but at the students. "If the pursuit of justice threatens institutions," he said softly, "then perhaps the question is not whether justice is emotional, but whether the institution is afraid." Silence. Whitmore took another step forward. "Fear?" he repeated. "You accuse this university of fear?" "I accuse no one," King answered. "I only observe that moral discomfort is often disguised as intellectual superiority." A sharp intake of breath came from somewhere near the front. Whitmore's composure cracked for the first time. "You presume to lecture scholars," he snapped, "about superiority?" King did not flinch. I presume only to ask, he said evenly, whether scholarship without humility becomes another form of power. The hall was no longer divided between speaker and audience. It was divided between belief and pride. Whitmore stared at him, not as a colleague, not as a guest, but as a challenge. And in that moment, what had been scheduled as a lecture transformed into something the university had not prepared for, a confrontation, and it had only just begun. No one announced a debate. There was no formal shift in format, no moderator stepping forward, no rearranging of chairs, and yet the entire lecture hall understood that the evening had changed shape. This was no longer a guest address. It had become a test, and not the kind listed in any syllabus. Professor Whitmore remained standing in the aisle, one hand resting lightly on the back of an empty chair, as if claiming territory. "You speak of humility," he said, voice steadier now, colder. "Yet you arrive in academic institutions and presume to redefine the foundations upon which they stand." King rested both palms on the podium. "I was invited," he replied. A faint ripple moved through the students. Whitmore ignored it. "Yes," he said sharply, "invited to inspire, to uplift, perhaps even to agitate, but not to dismantle centuries of philosophical rigor with moral abstractions." King tilted his head slightly. "Is justice an abstraction, Professor?" Whitmore gave a thin smile. "Justice is a construct," he replied, "developed, contested, revised. It is not a divine certainty handed down to soothe collective guilt." There were nods among several faculty members. King's eyes moved across the room, calm, searching. "And yet," he said, "every great reform in human history began with a moral claim that exceeded existing structures." Whitmore stepped forward another pace. "That is precisely the romantic myth I object to," he snapped. "Revolutions are not born of sermons. They are born of force, negotiation, and institutional leverage. Your rhetoric encourages unrest under the illusion of righteousness." The word unrest lingered heavily. King did not retreat. "If unrest reveals injustice," he answered quietly, "then perhaps the injustice precedes the unrest." The tension thickened. Whitmore's gaze hardened. "You make suffering sound noble," he said, "but suffering does not grant philosophical authority." A murmur, sharper this time, ran through the back rows. King's expression shifted slightly. Not anger, not even offense. Something closer to disappointment. "No," he said slowly, "suffering does not grant authority, but ignoring suffering forfeits credibility." Several students began to clap, tentative at first. Whitmore raised his voice to cut through it. "You are skilled at reframing," he said, "but universities do not operate on applause. We operate on evidence, on logic, on disciplined thought." "And what," King asked gently, "is the logical defense of inequality?" Whitmore's jaw tightened. "You presume inequality is always injustice?" "I observe," King replied, "that when inequality is enforced through exclusion, humiliation, or law, it becomes injustice." The word humiliation hung in the air like a quiet accusation. Whitmore's lips pressed thin. "Dr. King," he said, tone sharpening, "your movement thrives on moral dramatization, but civilization is complex. Stability requires hierarchy." There it was, not shouted, not vulgar, but unmistakable. Several students shifted in their seats. One young woman in the third row stared openly at Whitmore now. King's voice remained measured. "Hierarchy," he repeated softly. "On what basis?" Whitmore did not hesitate. "On demonstrated competence, on cultural development, on the capacity to sustain institutions." A pause. The implication settled heavily across the hall. King did not blink. "And who," he asked, "determines competence?" Whitmore lifted his chin slightly. "History," he said. King leaned forward almost imperceptibly. "History," he replied, "has often been written by those who benefited from the hierarchy they defend." A sharper murmur. Whitmore's composure flickered. "You reduce scholarship to conspiracy," he said. "That is intellectually lazy." "I reduce nothing," King answered calmly. "I simply ask whether structures built in exclusion can evaluate fairness objectively." The rector shifted visibly now, hands clasped tight. Whitmore exhaled through his nose. You suggest this institution, he said carefully, is morally compromised. King looked around the hall, at the stone walls, the stained glass, the students holding notebooks that had stopped moving. I suggest, he said quietly, that every institution must choose whether it protects truth or protects itself. The silence that followed was different from before. It was no longer polite. It was dividing. Whitmore glanced back at his colleagues. Some avoided his gaze. You speak, he said finally, voice lower now, as though moral certainty grants superiority. King's reply came without delay. No, he said. Moral responsibility grants accountability. Whitmore's eyes narrowed. And who, he asked, holds you accountable? King met his stare fully for the first time. The same standard I ask of you. The room felt smaller. Whitmore opened his mouth to respond, and for a fraction of a second, nothing came. Students were no longer shifting. They were watching. And for the first time that evening, it was not the invited guest who appeared on trial. It was the professor, and the duel had only deepened. The lecture hall had stopped breathing. No one moved. No one coughed. Even the old wooden beams above seemed to hold themselves still, as if the building understood that something far more serious than a disagreement was unfolding beneath it. Professor Whitmore remained standing in the aisle, rigid, composed, but only just. He had expected applause from his colleagues, perhaps a few approving nods. Instead, he felt the weight of hundreds of eyes measuring him. Accountability, he repeated carefully. You speak as though morality is fixed, as though you alone possess clarity while the rest of us hide behind complexity. King did not rush his response. I do not claim clarity, he said evenly. I claim responsibility. A subtle murmur passed through the students. Whitmore pressed forward. Moral claims shift with power and culture, he said. What you call injustice, another era may call necessity. Philosophy exists precisely because certainty is dangerous. King nodded slightly. Yes, he replied. Certainty without humility is dangerous. Whitmore's lips tightened. And you presume to teach humility to scholars? King's voice remained calm. No, I ask scholars to practice what they teach. A sharper murmur this time. Whitmore tried to regain dominance through precision. Let us be specific, he said. On what philosophical foundation do you base your condemnation of inequality? Are you appealing to natural law, social contract theory, utilitarian ethics, or are we to accept scripture as public argument? The question was crafted like a blade, narrow, technical, designed to corner. King did not step back. If you want natural law, he said, then we begin with inherent human worth, not worth granted by majority approval. If you want social contract theory, then we admit a contract written to exclude is not legitimate consent, but coercion. Several students leaned forward. And if you prefer utilitarianism, King continued, then the greatest good cannot be calculated by ignoring those forced to carry its cost. Whitmore folded his arms. And scripture? He pressed. King's gaze did not waver. If a man claims to love God while defending systems that humiliate God's children, that contradiction is not theological. It is moral. The hall grew heavier. Whitmore sensed control slipping and hardened his tone. You see, he said to the room, this is rhetoric. He reframes everything as moral drama. King turned slightly toward the audience. Is it drama, he asked softly, to describe humiliation as real? No one answered. Whitmore's voice sharpened. Suffering does not grant philosophical authority. No, King replied, but ignoring suffering forfeits moral credibility. That line struck deeper than the others. Whitmore shifted his stance. You imply, he said slowly, that institutions like this are complicit in injustice. King paused, letting the question rest in open air. I imply, he said at last, that any institution must choose whether it protects truth or protects itself. The silence now was not neutral. It was dividing. A senior professor near the front shifted uncomfortably. Two students exchanged glances that carried the electricity of recognition. Whitmore felt the shift and struck harder. You encourage unrest, he said. You destabilize order under the banner of righteousness. King's reply came without volume. Unrest, he said, is often the sound of injustice being heard for the first time. Whitmore's composure flickered. History, he said sharply, does not remember idealists. It remembers those who build and preserve civilization. King met his gaze fully. History also remembers, he answered, those who mistook dominance for wisdom. A student near the back exhaled audibly. Whitmore stepped closer now, abandoning distance. Do you truly believe, he demanded, voice echoing slightly off the stone walls, that you belong here among serious minds? There it was. Not an argument, a challenge to legitimacy. The room felt as if it tilted. The rector half rose from his seat, uncertain whether to intervene. King leaned slightly toward the microphone. Yes, he said calmly, and I believe you do too. The answer confused Whitmore, and that confusion showed. King continued. Belonging is not granted by tradition, he said. It is earned by courage, the courage to examine one's own power as rigorously as one examines others. Whitmore's jaw tightened. You suggest I fear examination? I suggest, King replied evenly, that moral discomfort is often disguised as intellectual superiority. The line landed cleanly. The hall was no longer evaluating King. It was evaluating Whitmore. A young philosophy student, pale with nerves, stood halfway from his seat before sitting back down again. The tension in the room felt like pressure building beneath glass. Whitmore tried one last assertion of dominance. You mistake eloquence for victory, he said coldly. King shook his head gently. No, he answered. I mistake silence for agreement. The words settled into the audience like weight. Whitmore looked around him, at colleagues who were no longer nodding, at students who were no longer intimidated. For the first time that evening, the professor did not look like the authority in the room. He looked like a man defending a position that suddenly required defense. And in that moment, something irreversible happened. The debate stopped being theoretical. It became personal. Not because King had attacked him, but because Whitmore had revealed what he truly feared. Not that King was wrong, but that he might be right, and the room had begun to see it. Whitmore realized too late that the room was no longer responding to his reputation. It was responding to his tone. Authority, once unquestioned, had begun to sound defensive. He adjusted his cuffs slowly, as though restoring order through posture alone. You are skilled, he said, voice colder now. But skill is not substance. Universities are not moved by applause. They are moved by reason. King did not counter immediately. He let the word reason linger, as if weighing it. Then let us reason, he replied quietly. Does reason demand hierarchy? Whitmore answered without hesitation. Civilization demands hierarchy. Competence is not evenly distributed. Leadership is not evenly distributed. Influence is not evenly distributed. The word evenly was deliberate. Some students shifted in their seats. King tilted his head slightly. And who measures competence? He asked. History, Whitmore replied again. King nodded once. History, he said, has often been written by those seated comfortably at its desk. A faint ripple moved through the hall. Whitmore's restraint thinned. You speak as though power itself is corruption, he snapped. But without structured power, societies collapse. King's voice remained steady. I do not condemn structure, he said. I question whether structure is just. Whitmore stepped closer, now only a few feet from the podium. You accuse, he said, without naming your accusation. King met his eyes. Very well, he answered calmly. When an institution prides itself on intellectual excellence, yet resists the idea that certain minds have historically been denied equal footing, it risks defending tradition over truth. The air tightened. Whitmore's face flushed faintly. You imply, he said carefully, that this university has denied you footing. I imply, King replied, that the question should never need to be asked. That line struck harder than any raised voice could have. A student in the third row finally began clapping, hesitant, then firmer. The sound echoed awkwardly before dying out. Whitmore turned toward the students. This, he said sharply, is precisely the danger. Emotional mobilization. You are being swayed by tone, not argument. King did not look at the students. They are being swayed, he said, by recognition. Whitmore laughed once. Short, dry. Recognition of what? Of themselves, King answered. Whitmore's composure cracked visibly now. You encourage resentment, he said. You frame intellectual disagreement as moral failure. I frame indifference to injustice, King replied, as moral failure. There it was. Clearer now, sharper. Whitmore's voice rose. You would dismantle institutions because they fail to satisfy your moral narrative. King shook his head gently. I would strengthen institutions, he said, by asking them to live up to their own principles. The hall was no longer tense. It was charged. The rector, seated stiffly near the front, finally stood fully. Gentlemen, he began, but Whitmore cut him off, eyes fixed on King. You speak of humility, he said, voice tight. Yet you stand here accusing scholars of arrogance. King's answer came without hesitation. Arrogance, he said, is not disagreement. Whitmore leaned forward. Then what is it? It is believing, King replied calmly, that your position is unthreatened by examination. The line landed cleanly. Whitmore's breathing had changed now, shallower, sharper. You are very careful, he said. I must be, King answered. History has taught me that men who feel challenged sometimes mistake their discomfort for insult. A murmur swept the hall. Whitmore's restraint shattered. Do not patronize me, he snapped. The words echoed louder than intended. The entire hall felt it. The slip. King did not smile. I would never, he said softly. Whitmore realized too late what had happened. His tone, the tone he prided himself on controlling, had betrayed him. He had moved from philosopher to adversary, and the students saw it. A young man near the aisle stood abruptly. With respect, Professor, he said, voice trembling but audible, he's answering your questions. The interruption stunned the faculty row. Whitmore turned slowly. Sit down, he said sharply. The student hesitated, then sat. But the damage was done. The hierarchy had cracked. King did not capitalize on it. He did not escalate. That restraint made the moment heavier. Professor, he said quietly, I am not your enemy. Whitmore's jaw tightened. Then stop speaking like a prosecutor. King's eyes softened slightly. I speak like a citizen. The difference hung in the air. Whitmore's shoulders squared again. But something fundamental had shifted. He was no longer dictating the rhythm of the room. He was reacting. And in that reaction, the power dynamic reversed. For the first time that night, the university's most respected philosopher looked uncertain. Not about his theories, but about his authority. And everyone in the hall knew that the evening had crossed a line it could not uncross. The duel was no longer about ideas. It was about pride. And pride, once wounded in public, rarely retreats quietly. The hall no longer felt like a lecture. It felt like exposure. Professor Whitmore stood rigid, but the stillness that once projected authority now carried strain. His reputation had always entered rooms before he did. Tonight, it seemed to be standing behind him. You speak like a citizen, he repeated coldly. This is not a town square. This is a university. King nodded calmly. And a university, he replied, should be the safest place for truth to be examined. Whitmore's jaw tightened. You use the word truth as though it belongs to you. It belongs to all of us, King answered evenly. A faint murmur moved through the students. Steady, no longer hesitant. Whitmore pushed harder. You shield your movement in morality, he said. If I disagree, I am arrogant. If I challenge you, I am prejudiced. It is a convenient defense. King did not interrupt. You are not arrogant for disagreeing, he said. You are arrogant only if you assume disagreement threatens you. That landed. Whitmore's composure thinned. You imply I feel threatened? I imply, King said quietly, that anger often reveals insecurity. The silence tightened. You overstep, Whitmore snapped. I respond, King answered. The room shifted again, visibly. Whitmore stepped closer, abandoning academic distance. You accuse scholars of hiding prejudice behind sophistication. King met his gaze fully. I accuse no one by name, he said, but when a man questions whether I belong among serious minds, The question deserves clarity. Whitmore's lips parted slightly. For clarity, King continued, voice steady. What exactly were you measuring? I was measuring rigor, Whitmore replied quickly. And what evidence, King asked softly, did you lack? There it was, the pause. Small, barely visible, but fatal. A student near the front stood. With respect, Professor, she said carefully, he answered every framework you presented. Whitmore turned sharply. Sit down. She did not. I am sitting, she said calmly. A ripple passed through the hall. Whitmore turned back to King, but the balance had shifted. The room was no longer automatically his. You are skilled, Whitmore said more quietly now. You control tone. You control narrative. I control myself, King replied. Whitmore exhaled through his nose. You think I am prejudiced. King paused before answering. I think, he said carefully, that pride sometimes speaks faster than fairness. The line did not explode. It settled. Whitmore's shoulders lowered slightly. And if I were wrong? He asked almost reluctantly. King answered without delay. Then this institution's strength would be measured by its willingness to admit it. The room was utterly still. The rector stood slowly. Professor Whitmore, he said cautiously, perhaps we should conclude the exchange. But Whitmore did not move. Instead, he did something no one expected. He asked for the microphone. A collective tension swept through the hall. King stepped aside without hesitation. Whitmore approached the podium, slower now, not as a challenger, but as a man aware that every word would matter. He adjusted the microphone. I believed I was defending standards, he began. His voice was steady, but altered. I believed I was protecting academic rigor. A pause. But perhaps, he continued carefully, I allowed skepticism to harden into something less admirable. The hall did not breathe. He looked briefly toward King. It was not my intention to question your intellect, he said. Another pause. Yet my words suggested otherwise. That was the admission, not dramatic, not theatrical, but undeniable. And for that, he added, I accept responsibility. A breath moved through the audience. Not applause, not celebration, but release. But the division did not vanish. From the faculty row, someone whispered, he's conceding too much. A student near the back muttered, he had to. The fracture was visible now, not between King and Whitmore, but within the university itself. Whitmore stepped back from the microphone. King did not reclaim it. He simply nodded once, not triumphantly, not smugly, but firmly. The hierarchy had not collapsed, but it had cracked, and cracks, once seen, cannot be unseen. The apology did not end the night. It divided it. For several seconds after Professor Whitmore stepped back from the microphone, the hall remained suspended in silence. Not respectful silence, but evaluative silence. The kind that asks, was that enough? Whitmore returned slowly to his place in the aisle, but he did not sit. Sitting would have looked smaller. Standing now looked uncertain. The rector cleared his throat. We thank both speakers, he began carefully, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. The script he had prepared for a dignified academic evening no longer applied. From the third row, a senior faculty member leaned toward another and whispered, not quietly enough. He didn't apologize for anything specific. A student behind them whispered back, he did. You just didn't like hearing it. The fracture was no longer subtle. Whitmore faced the room again. I will clarify, he said, voice firmer now, as if trying to regain definition. My objection was never to Dr. King's right to speak. It was to the elevation of moral rhetoric above disciplined inquiry. There were nods from part of the faculty. King finally stepped back toward the microphone, not to rebut, not to dominate, but to close something unfinished. Professor, he said evenly, discipline without conscience becomes cold. Conscience without discipline becomes reckless. The danger lies not in their union, but in their separation. The line did not seek applause. It sought balance. Whitmore did not interrupt this time. A student near the aisle stood again, the same young man from earlier. With respect, he said, addressing the hall, not just the podium, If intellectual rigor excludes voices historically denied entry, then rigor becomes gatekeeping. A ripple of agreement passed through the students. A faculty member snapped, "This is becoming political." "It was always political," someone answered from the back. The room had shifted into open dispute now. Not shouting, but sharp exchanges layered over each other. Lines drawn, alliances forming in real time. Whitmore raised his hand slightly. "This is precisely what I feared," he said. "Emotion overtaking structure." King looked at him steadily. "No," he said quietly. "This is examination." Whitmore's jaw tightened, but he did not argue. Instead, something unexpected happened. A respected senior professor, older than Whitmore, known for caution, rose slowly from the front row. "I have served this institution for 30 years, he said, "and I have disagreed with Dr. King's methods." A pause. "But disagreement does not grant dismissal." The words were measured, controlled, heavy. He turned slightly toward Whitmore. "We must be careful that our defense of standards does not mask defensiveness." The hall absorbed it. Whitmore looked at him, not angry now, but exposed. He exhaled once. "My words were sharper than necessary," he said finally. "I allowed irritation to shape tone." A student called out quietly, "It was more than tone." Whitmore did not snap this time. He looked toward the voice. "Perhaps," he admitted, "it was." That was the final concession, small but irreversible. The debate did not dissolve. Clusters of conversation broke out immediately as the rector formally closed the event. Students argued in the aisles. Faculty members debated near the stage. He was defending academic integrity. No, he questioned belonging. He apologized. He minimized. The building itself seemed louder now than during the confrontation. King stepped down from the podium without ceremony. He did not linger to collect validation. He did not seek allies. He walked calmly toward the exit aisle. As he passed Whitmore, the two men paused for a fraction of a second. No handshake, no hostility, just recognition. Whitmore spoke first, quietly enough that only King could hear. "I did not expect you to withstand that." King's reply was calm. "I did not come to withstand," he said. "I came to be heard." Whitmore said nothing more. King continued toward the doors. Behind him, the university buzzed, not with unity, not with resolution, but with argument. And that was the real consequence. The hierarchy had not collapsed. The institution still stood. Whitmore would still lecture. Students would still enroll. But something invisible had shifted. The question, "Who belongs?" could no longer be asked without echo. And once an echo exists, silence is impossible. They would remember that night in different ways. Some would say the professor defended reason. Some would say he revealed pride. Some would say the apology was enough. Others would say it was late. But no one who sat in that hall could honestly claim they had witnessed a polite lecture. They had witnessed a mask crack. And once a mask cracks in public, it never fits the same again.